that you're in this material, and I am honored to be the person to share it with you. So we're going to spend about the next hour together going through some of Norman Rockwell's most familiar images and maybe some images that you've never seen before. And we'll be looking at it through the lens of how Norman Rockwell could create such great stories in his images that made us all feel like we were part of this same American story. And then at the same time, he could create images that were really sort of poignant in the way that they could show isolation and loneliness in a way that was still could make you feel included. So we'll look at that particular talent that he had, and then we'll sort of shift and look at how he used those talents in terms of examining race in American culture. So we will be talking about this incredible image that I have on screen here, which many of you probably know and love, but we'll be looking at that a little bit later on. And that is, of course, the painting called The Problem We All Live With. But first, I want to start off with a little bit of an introduction to Norman Rockwell, very brief, because you're probably here tonight because you're already familiar with him. But I think it's important to just review the fact that he was born at the end of the 19th century. He died in 1978. He is, without a doubt, America's most beloved illustrator, and he called himself just that. He didn't think of himself or didn't call himself a fine art artist. He saw what he did as sort of storytelling, and it was for commercial purposes. It was to sell greeting cards and magazines and calendars and that sort of thing. He did have formal training as an artist, and he worked in oils. We can see him sitting here in the photograph with his paintbrushes and his easel. He had an incredible talent, and we'll see a real eye for detail that I think always creates an appreciation for his work when you examine it. And he is, of course, most closely associated with the Saturday Evening Post. He worked for that publication for 47 years. And he created more than 320 covers for them in that time. So he was prolific. And these images that he created, particularly after World War II, really helped to not just reflect American culture, but define American culture. You can think of these images, I always think of them functioning almost like a sitcom that people could sort of sit and study for a week before the next issue came out. And so there was humor, there was, again, this kind of poignancy to it, and an opportunity to really speak about what American culture was like, what it looked like in the past, and what it was becoming. So because he's so closely associated with American culture, we often think of Norman Rockwell as being closely associated with patriotic themes as well. And of course, he had, I believe it was like a 66-year relationship with the Boy Scouts of America. He worked with them for a very, very long time, creating annual calendars. And he also painted presidential portraits on both sides of the aisle. And then just the year before his death, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So a really sort of remarkable career, and so impactful in terms of our in terms of the material culture of our lives, and then modern culture as well. So let's dive in and start off with one of my favorite Norman Rockwell images. Now, this image, I will preface by saying, really doesn't have anything to do with race, but it's a really fun image to get people warmed up looking at Norman Rockwell and getting sort of accustomed to thinking about him as a storyteller. There's a lot going on here, and I encourage you to look up this picture later and talk about it with family and friends. In an ideal world today, we could have a great discussion about it. It's called The Jury or The Holdout. And of course, your eye probably goes to this really striking young woman. I always thought she looked like Audrey Hepburn, who is our holdout in the jury room. We can see on the transom up here, it's labeled The Jury, and we are inside. We can see that this jury's been debating for some time with all of the crumpled paper on the floor and all the smoke hanging in the air. And there is just one person who can't agree on a verdict here. We've got one gentleman over here who's kind of checked out on the process. If this was painted today, he'd be on his cell phone, of course. And the rest of them are trying to persuade or coerce this young woman. Norman Rockwell even included himself hanging over this woman's head, trying to change her mind in not the kindest way possible either. So this probably reminds you of the play or the movie 12 Angry Men, and he's certainly referencing that with this picture. But I bring in this picture to start off, to emphasize the fact that Norman Rockwell wasn't just interested in the justice system, he was interested in social justice. Because when he painted this picture in 1959, across the country, there were still many states that didn't even allow women to serve on juries. So he's making a real comment here in terms of the impact women can have when they're allowed into a process. And our association with 12 Angry Men here shows that this person, our holdout, this woman in this case, is probably really the conscience of this group and may in fact be able to change people's mind and help everybody reach a more just decision in the end. So Norman Rockwell sees, we'll see how social justice sort of infiltrates his work over time. Now, let me give you the lay of the land, how we'll be moving through the material tonight. And I'll be talking fast because there is a ton of it. We'll look very quickly at this notion of inclusion, how Norman Rockwell could create images that make us all feel like we're a part of this American dream. And then on the other side of the coin, how he could create these images of loneliness and isolation that, again, are still remarkably relatable. So, and then once we sort of see how he has that talent in terms of his storytelling, we'll turn our attention to his relationship with the Saturday Evening Post and how he created images that deal with the issue of race in America for that specific publication. So let's dive into this notion of feeling included. Particularly after World War II, Norman Rockwell began to tell the story of middle-class American life. And the subtext here is, of course, white middle-class American life. But he would create these family images that were intended to be as relatable as possible to the audiences for the Saturday Evening Post. And with an image like this one, I love this picture. It's called Going and Coming from 1947. We see a middle-class American family heading out to a day at the beach. And we've got the father, the mother, several little children in the car, even a dog, and even grandma. And of course, there's a joke here, and as there are in so many Norman Rockwell paintings. As they're going, they're full of confidence, full of energy and excitement. And as they come home at dusk, everybody's sort of deflated. You can see it from the little girl's bubble, literally deflated. Energy is low, mom has fallen asleep, dad's cigar is now just a little stump in his mouth. But the joke is, of course, grandma looks exactly the same. She didn't expend a lot of energy today. So, so there's the joke there, and there's literally a character for everybody to relate to. Another image that I think was created to be as relatable as possible to American middle class is this picture here from Easter in 1959. So we have a family that is heading out to church services dutifully, dressed up, beautiful hats on, heading out to church, sort of marching in single file. And then, of course, we have dad, who is avoiding the responsibility of going to church, the obligation of going to church. And he's sitting in this debris field of newspapers here, slouching down in his chair as if they don't know that he's there. Of course, they do. We've got this incredible sort of pattern of these vertical stripes repeating throughout the picture, from his pajamas, which always kind of look like prison garb to me, to the pleated skirts, to the vertical shears here that reinforce that verticality in this picture. But the little detail that I love the most, other than the little boy who looks very wistfully over at his father as though he too wishes that he could stay, is that Norman Rockwell gave this disheveled dad here little devil horns for skipping church in his tousled hair. So again, I mean, who among us hasn't had a family member that's tried to skip a social obligation or a religious service like this, and they feel guilty about it, but they're perfectly fine to stay home. So so again, there's somebody here for every one of us to connect to. Norman Rockwell was particularly good at creating images of homecoming. Comings. And this was actually the last Christmas cover that he painted for the Saturday Evening Post in 1948. There's just a few references to Christmas here. You can probably just make out the Christmas tree in the top right. There's some presents under this figure's arms, but otherwise, this Christmas picture is really about a family coming together. And again, Norman Rockwell has included himself and several of his family members. He's actually even included Grandma Moses over here. But this reunion is just so joyful. We see just all of these faces lit up, just delighted to see this young man return home, either from college or the big city. Another great detail here that I always get a kick out of is his bag is just bursting, literally bursting with clothing here, and you just know that he's brought home his dirty laundry to do. So there's always something that's a little bit heartwarming and something you can sort of giggle at too. And then, of course, we have another scene that makes us all feel so connected and helps to define us as Americans. And that is this picture from his For Freedom series called The Freedom from Want. But I think most Americans just think of this as Thanksgiving. We look at this picture and we see, multiple generations gathering around a table filled with food, a gigantic turkey, and somehow this picture helps to define the way all of us celebrate major holidays. And Norman Rockwell's great innovation here was to include this figure down at the bottom who looks out at us and extends the table to us, makes us feel like we are all a part of this American middle class dream, which of course was so different from how the world was just a few years prior. The freedom from want is really about the freedom from suffering, from worrying about where your next meal is. But now today, we just think of it as, the ability to consume however much you want at Thanksgiving. So now let's look at the other side of the coin, how Norman Rockwell, in addition to creating these great scenes about American life, how he could create these other scenes that are, so well, I mean, they touch your heart in a very different way, and sometimes there's humor there too. But they connect with like almost like our saddest, most interior selves. So in this cover here, we're looking at a ticket seller who's literally stuck behind bars, but he's selling tickets to all of these wonderful destinations all over the globe. And Norman Rockwell's included the sign here: "Are you bored? Travel." And of course, this guy is stuck. He doesn't have that ability to do that. And I think all of us can relate to that feeling of being stuck, whether it's a dead-end job or just feeling like you're at a point in your life where you need to be someplace else geographically and you can't get there. So he's tapped into something that's really universal here. I think he also does that very well with this picture here, the skiers on a train from 1962. And he does it not just with the storytelling, but also with the color. The skiers here are all joyful, they're jubilant, they're in red. And then we have this man who is so alone in a crowd, and he's in black and gray. It's as though he doesn't even exist as this party goes on around him. Sometimes feeling alone in a crowd is the loneliest kind of feeling you can experience. And so interesting that Norman Rockwell chooses to tap into that sort of experience in order to sell a magazine in this case. One other picture that sort of riffs on that notion of alone in a crowd is this little girl sitting at the top of the stairs looking down at her parents' holiday party. And this was for the cover of McCall's in 1962. Again, the colors of this picture reinforce this notion of isolation. The party down below is all of these warm golden hues. It beckons us. We all want to be a part of that party. And somehow by looking over this little girl's shoulder, we all become that little girl. We all long for this different point in our lives. And we all know what it feels like to be away and separate from something that seems so joyful. Now, the last image of loneliness that I wanted to share with you is also one of my favorites. And I think it's actually one of Norman Rockwell's favorites because he actually painted another painting of himself painting this very picture. This is called The Soda Jerk from 1953. And in many ways, it's a brilliant picture in terms of its composition and its colors. Notice that the three teenage girls here are all wearing primary colors, but notice how much of the rest of the picture is just pure white from the counter to the boy's shirt. So this is a picture essentially about some real heavy duty flirting, right? Our soda jerk is neglecting his other responsibilities. He's not even clearing the counter over here. There's just a lot of eye contact happening. But this picture, in order to save it from being too saccharine, Norman Rockwell included this little boy, or this young man at the top left, who is sipping his milkshake by himself and watching everything else unfold. He's on the outside. He is no doubt thinking, what does that soda jerk have that I don't have? And haven't we all felt that way at some point in our lives? Whether this image takes you back to feeling like you were a teenager, or if you're on the dating scene now, you might even wonder this sort of thing occasionally. So again, Norman Rockwell, even with these scenes of loneliness, can tap into something that is universal in our experiences. So let's think about how, shift gears now, think about how he took these incredible storytelling powers that we just looked at, and how he puts them in service to the Saturday Evening Post, especially as we consider the subject of race. So our cover here for the Saturday Evening Post is, let's see here, it's from 1941, and we have a young woman who is wearing really dirty saddle shoes and sort of her letter sweater from school, and she's holding her own issue of the Saturday Evening Post in front of her. And of course, there's a beautiful older woman on the cover, and there's the joke of that's, it's taking on her face here. So we have to remember that there's an aspirational notion that comes along with these covers, and that they were designed very specifically, not just by Norman Rockwell, but also by his editors, in order to tell a story that can be easily recognized, but then also enjoyed over time. So they're very carefully crafted. And as Norman Rockwell's creating these images, they're going out to the post circulation, which at its peak was around 6 million readers. So as we go through these next few images, I think it's important to again, sort of keep in mind just what a great storyteller he was. So that being said, the Saturday Evening Post rarely featured people of color on the cover. And this was a really specific editorial choice. And I just wanted to share with you briefly how other major publications at the time, if not frequently, occasionally featured people of color on the cover in order to tell, the major stories of the day. So we have Time and Newsweek and Life magazine sort of examining people of significance in the country. But there was a specific choice on the part of the Saturday Evening Post, which was also very mindfully trying to attain a national audience in the same way that these other publications were. They made a specific choice that Norman Rockwell once described. And so these are his own words. He said, George Horace Lorimer, the Saturday Evening Post editor, who was a very liberal man, told me never to show colored people except as servants. So Norman Rockwell was dealing with a very specific editorial choice. And let's turn our attention to how he handled that. First, I want to show you how that editorial choice translated to covers of the Saturday Evening Post. And I want to show you just a few examples of covers by other artists, just to show you what race looked like when it did appear on the covers. So going back to 1930, you can see this illustrator chose to create an image of white men in blackface, a scene of minstrelsy, which of course, particularly by today's standards, would be considered just an over-the-top, overtly racist image. As we go on in time, images weren't as overtly racist, but they've sort of reinforced the power structure that already existed in America by subscribing to that editorial policy. So again, these few images that I'm showing you now are not by Norman Rockwell, but this one in particular was by his mentor, J.C. Leyendecker. So this is called The End of Vacation, and we see again sort of this gorgeous, slender white woman. She looks like she could be a starlet. She's carrying flowers. She's waving goodbye to her friends, and then just behind her, from our perspective, is a Black man who is carrying all of her bags, and it looks like there's at least 5 or 6 of them, and golf clubs, and so he's burdened by her possessions,
Hold on.
light as air. So again, we see this kind of power dynamic that's being reinforced here. J.C. Leyendecker, the same artist, gives us this cover in 1937, where 2 boys have climbed a telephone pole, or a light pole in this case, to watch a 4th of July parade taking place underneath them. The white boy has climbed to the top, and the Black boy sort of holds on for dear life and looks down with this look of real fear that he could lose his grasp and fall to not death, of course, but fall and potentially get hurt. So we see again this hierarchy, almost spelled out like a totem pole in this case, to reinforce the norms that were a priority to the editors of the Post. And I'll just note briefly too, I mean, just pay attention to the clothing and how the white boy is sort of well dressed, and the Black boy here is wearing sort of ripped and tattered clothing. And then we have this notion of the Black Mammy, which is sort of a racial stereotype that was reinforced repeatedly on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. And it's probably worth mentioning that if a certain type of person is only shown in one way, through one lens repeatedly in mass media, how damaging that can be to whoever that group is that's being targeted, in this case, Black women. So the Black Mammy type appears again and again on the covers of the Saturday Evening Post. Over here on the left, we see a Black woman who is working for a white family, telling stories to a white child as she does work in the kitchen. On the right, she is cleaning her own home, but we see the type with the apron, with the handkerchief on her head, and then always a very, very plump woman. Occasionally, this coded sort of visual vocabulary is used to portray white women, but it's used in such a way that it is intended to poke fun of a white woman. So in this case, this is a spring cover, May 15th cover from 1937, and this woman who is all dressed and ready to do her spring cleaning is on a pedestal, and you can probably just make out the text here of Queen of the May. Of course, she doesn't look anything like a beauty queen. She is dressed to look like what was the code for a Black mammy. Now, generally speaking, when white women, especially white middle-class women, appeared on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, they looked as lovely as Donna Reed, and they were slender and beautiful, even if they were in sort of awful situations, like this woman who's walking into her kitchen that's been destroyed by her children. She still looks lovely. But again, that Black mammy type just comes back again and again and again on the covers, reinforcing this particular view of Black women from the time. This image all the way over here on the right has always been a particularly dark image, this idea of sweeping things under the rug. And I always wonder if there's some sort of correlation to the onset of World War II, because that's a 1941 image here. But all of these things are tied into mass media. And of course, in 1939, you have Gone with the Wind, and the portrayal of the Black mammy from Gone with the Wind. And even though Hattie McDaniel won the Oscar for this, we know that she was still subjected to rules around where she could sit at the Oscars, and she was certainly sort of condemned afterwards for accepting a role like this one. We see this actually still happening today with books and well, with the movie The Help, based on the book, where you had some of America's best Black actresses working on this film, and they said later on that they regretted doing so because the movie didn't tell their stories in quite the way that they had anticipated. So let's turn our attention now back to Norman Rockwell and thinking about, okay, he's working in this culture at this time with this specific rule. And so what did his images of race look like? Well, early on in his career, he seems to have always been sort of interested in race in America. And I think it's worth noting that, he got his education as an artist in an urban area. He lived in New Rochelle outside of New York City. And then later on in his career, he moves to Vermont and then later Western Massachusetts. So he goes from a place where there's presumably a great deal of diversity to spending sort of the second half of his career in areas that were predominantly white. So at the beginning of his career, he has an interest in showing African Americans. Believe it or not, the image that we're looking at here is an advertisement. And I think it's going to blow your mind when I tell you what it's for. It's an ad for floor varnish. So he chose to tell a story with this. And his story is to show presumably a man who, like an itinerant musician who has come to this middle class home. They've pulled back the rug so that this little white boy can sort of beat out time on this beautifully varnished floor as this man plays the banjo. So it seems like a harmless enough image, but of course, America has this sort of complex history in terms of the way African Americans have been depicted throughout the 19th century and even earlier, in terms of depicting African Americans as having a natural ability to play and make music, particularly the banjo. So these are two images from the 19th century Currier and Ives prints that kind of reinforce this quote unquote natural ability. And then we see that kind of racist stereotype continuing on into the 20th century, where you see predominantly men in blackface performing minstrel shows with banjos that are, very clearly coded racist stereotypes. Now, the one sort of exception to this rule of how African American men have been portrayed playing banjos over time is this incredible painting on the left by Henry Tanner, America's really sort of first successful African American artist, who shows the banjo playing as this kind of tender intergenerational lesson here. And that leads us back to Norman Rockwell and his picture, and sort of wondering what was the inspiration for it, and how much of this kind of racist history of imagery of African Americans playing banjos influenced this particular image. It's hard to say. But when we get back to the Saturday Evening Post and his pictures that include African Americans, we can see that by and large, he is abiding by the rule that they had about, if you're going to show people of color, they have to be in subservient roles. So in the image on the left here, this is called He Went That Way from 1934. We see a well-dressed white woman who is in riding gear, who has been presumably thrown from her horse, and sort of a poor young Black boy who doesn't even have shoes on, essentially adding insult to her injury by showing her which direction her horse ran in. Over here, the 1940 cover called Full Treatment, we see a plump middle-class white man who's getting sort of like a spa treatment. It almost looks like he's getting a facial and a manicure, and he's also getting his shoes polished. And so if you have a good eye, you probably notice that the young man polishing his shoes is an African American. You can just make it out with the color of his skin over here. Interestingly, interestingly, Norman Rockwell has also included the detail of the soles of the holes in the soles of his shoes. So seemingly making a statement about his socioeconomic status by, even though he's almost barely included him in the imagery here. So as we move along in time, we'll see that Norman Rockwell becomes really interested in the subject of race and chooses new opportunities career-wise that allow him to examine race. And we'll get back to this particular image in just a moment, but I wanted to share with you another quote from Rockwell. He said, "I was born a white Protestant with some prejudices, which I'm continuously trying to eradicate." Now, this is a pretty impressive statement. I mean, I think in today's language, we would call him an anti-racist. He was very mindful of any prejudices that he had, and he was trying to be as open-minded and as accepting as possible. He's trying to work against the prejudices that he might have grown up with. And he took this so seriously that he actually estranged himself from his own brother, who he thought of as being too racist. So along these lines, Norman Rockwell began to seek out opportunities to illustrate stories in other magazines, that stories that that had characters that were Black, so that he could have the opportunity to paint them. This is a painting that he created as an illustration for a story that appeared in American Magazine in 1936. The story was called Love Wanga, which essentially means like a love voodoo. And it's a story, well, this scene in particular is sort of like a fish out of water scene. So it's this sort of a fancy city lady has gone to a country church because she's trying to find somebody to help her essentially cast a love spell. So you can see everybody in the country church is kind of checking her out because she sticks out like a sore thumb. And of course, she's just absolutely lovely. There's a number of art historians that say that she's perhaps one of the most beautiful women that Norman Rockwell has ever painted. But of course, these figures could have never appeared on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. The picture that we had looked at briefly before, here it is. This is another painting that he created for American Magazine, this time for 1940, for a story called The Proud Possessor. And it's a story essentially about a little white boy who gets these two dogs that he wants to keep, and he can't really keep them. And so he asks this Black boy to keep them for him. And this is the moment where the Black boy says, "Well, what are you going to do for me?" Now, this gives us a chance to talk about Norman Rockwell and his essentially the way he created images. Because these pictures were so highly detailed, Norman Rockwell relied very heavily on taking photographs of his models. And he would take anywhere from 50 to 100 photographs in preparation for a finished picture. And we can see that he also did drawings. Now, let's keep in mind that this second half of his career was in a predominantly white region. So if he was going to paint a Black person, he had to go out of his way to find a model to work for him. And in this case, I believe these models are standing on pedestals at Norman Rockwell's home. I believe this was his home in Vermont. So so he had to be very purposeful in an act like this. Now, let's turn our attention in the early 1940s to that For Freedom series that I referenced before. We saw The Freedom from Want earlier on. Now, this is probably his, well, without a doubt, his most famous series. It was done in 1943, inspired by Franklin Delano Roosevelt's 1941 State of the Union speech, where he talked about the four freedoms that all Americans enjoy: the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. As an aside, I just think this is such an extraordinary series, because if somebody handed you a pencil right now and said, "Draw me a picture of freedom from fear," it's a tough task to imagine. And so he, in his typical fashion, he created stories for us to understand these freedoms a little bit better. This didn't come easy to him. He worked on this series for a number of months, and he really labored over it. He lost about 15 pounds in the process, and he didn't have much weight to lose to to begin with. But in the end, these images were featured inside the Saturday Evening Post, and they also toured the country, helping to raise $132 million for the US Treasury in support of the war effort. So this was probably the most patriotic act any American artist has ever accomplished. But I wanted to show you these images because they do have to do with race, and they do have to do with Norman Rockwell's talents as a storyteller. So you'll notice right now, well, if I give you a quiz, one of these pictures is not like the other. And if you had to guess, which one would it be? Well, ding, 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 if you said freedom of religion, because Norman Rockwell really struggled with this picture. You'll notice the other images really, they have kind of a narrative to them. And this one is just these large heads and hands in prayer. What's the bigger story going on here? And here's the picture sort of up close. It's even in this kind of gray tones, but you'll notice that there are people of different faiths and different colors included in this picture. That was really important to Norman Rockwell, particularly with the freedom of religion poster. Or image painting, I should say. So this wasn't his original concept for the painting of freedom of religion. His original concept, and this is just a sketch that he ultimately abandons, and I apologize for the graininess of the image, but the original concept was to show people of different faiths gathering together peacefully, amicably in a barbershop. And so you see, you know, a Catholic priest over here, maybe this is a Protestant over here, and this was supposed to be a Jewish man who was getting shaved in the barber chair. Ultimately, Norman Rockwell felt like he was relying too heavily on stereotypes, so that's why he abandons this storyline. But you'll notice he also includes a Black man. I mean, he cuts him off by the frame, but he includes a Black man walking into this barbershop. It was always important for him to include race as part of this notion of tolerance and acceptance when it came to religion. So he abandons this concept and goes for the hands in prayer, the faces in profile. And I don't think, you know, any of us really have ever wondered why that picture sticks out so much in this series, but now we know he was really kind of struggling with how do you include race in this storyline. So let's continue on through the 1940s and see how Norman Rockwell continues to find ways to slip in the story of race in America in his Saturday Evening Post covers. This is a really beloved image from 1945. It's called Homecoming. Of course, it's the story of a GI returning from World War II to his very just delighted family. His mother, arms wide open, siblings running down the stairs, the dog sort of in flight, heading over to this GI. And again, we're seeing the GI from behind. And so we sort of take on his view of this entire neighborhood that is welcoming him home. And I should mention, Norman Rockwell went to Troy, New York, and he found this kind of tenement neighborhood. And it was really important to him to capture the details of this neighborhood. I think, you know, finding this kind of working class, almost rough and tumble neighborhood is a really interesting choice for him, because he could have very easily just chosen a suburban fantasy with white picket fences. But in this case, it's a densely packed community, and it shows, and he shows us all these different faces. So probably a dozen of them beyond the faces of the family. And of course, we have the posters with the blue star, which indicate that all of these families have somebody who is fighting in the war. And then that leads our eye up to this tree where we see the two boys perched very high in the tree, waving to their neighbor who has just arrived home. And that might recall for you J.C. Leindecker's painting from not even a decade before, where climbing that light post was again supposed to reinforce the hierarchy that existed in America. And Norman Rockwell flips the script here and shows us just two boys playing in an integrated neighborhood. And that is what he saw when he went to Troy, New York. And it was really important for him to tell that story on this cover. And somehow I think the picture was so powerful that the editors of the Saturday Evening Post let it slide. So a little bit of a tangent here, but this is a story to sort of tell you where Norman Rockwell's mind was around the middle of the 1940s. And this was a story that was taking place really near to him in Vermont. So what we're looking at here is a story from Life magazine called Sorority Fight. And it's a story about this woman named Crystal Malone, who was one of about 4 Black students at the University of Vermont. And she was invited to join a sorority while she was there, which was, of course, all white. And this became quite a stir. It becomes a national story, of course, because it's featured in Life magazine. The national organization for this particular sorority told these girls that they could not integrate the sorority. In fact, the woman who was in charge of the sorority drove up to Vermont from Washington, D.C. and said, no, this is not allowed. And so the women of this sorority went to the president of the University of Vermont and said, go to bat for us, essentially back us up in this decision. And he was really waffling. And so people began to write to the president of the University of Vermont and say, wherever they stood on this issue. But Norman Rockwell was one of the people who put pen to paper and wrote the president of the University of Vermont and said, support those girls, let them integrate that sorority. Think of the last time you wrote a letter to the editor or a letter to somebody in a decision-making role in order to support integration or social justice. That was important enough to Norman Rockwell that he did it. Ultimately, Crystal Malone was not allowed into the sorority, and the white women who were part of that sorority burned the charter. They said, we don't even want to be a part of this anymore. Believe it or not, that sorority did not apologize to Crystal Malone until 2008. And that is her much later on in life. So we're in the mid 1940s. I should mention that story took place in 1946. And that same year, Norman Rockwell was asked to paint the 4th of July cover for the Saturday Evening Post. So we're just coming off of World War II. Feelings of patriotism obviously swelling in America, this sense of this newfound leadership in the world. And so Norman Rockwell is tasked with creating an image of the Statue of Liberty for the 4th of July cover. And I should mention the Statue of Liberty had been on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post many times by many other artists. And the image on the left just gives you a sense in terms of what those other depictions look like. Pretty straightforward depictions. But Norman Rockwell is a storyteller, and he wants to tell us more than just a picture of a statue. So this early sketch here shows that he's thinking about all these different people standing at the pedestal, looking up at the sculpture and sort of, pondering its significance. Ultimately, he abandons this approach and he begins to think about who are the people that clean the statue. He got in touch with the organization that runs it. And he says, do you have any photographs of people cleaning the Statue of Liberty? They said, no, because we don't even have people that do that. But we do have people that clean the torch. And so Norman Rockwell said, give me those images. And in the end, he decides to paint a really kind of revolutionary picture of the Statue of Liberty that doesn't feature the liberty at all. It features her arm and it emphasizes that torch, which is a brilliant composition. It's all about America leading the way now for the rest of the world, leading the way in freedom, lighting the way for the rest of the world. There's so much power and authority in that torch and so much hope. It's really incredible. And so Norman Rockwell, it was important to him to show people working on the torch, to show it being cleaned. And let's face it, it adds a really interesting dimension to this picture beyond just looking at a sculpture. And so, of course, you probably noticed by now that of the 5 figures who are working on cleaning that heavy leaded amber glass, one of them is African American. And he is not in a subservient position at all in this case. I mean, he is an equal in terms of the work that they are doing. So this image found its way into the collection of the White House, and it was on display in the Oval Office. And I think just about 10 years or so ago, there was a researcher who was looking at Norman Rockwell's work and considering issues of race, looked very carefully at this picture and thought, I wonder how Norman Rockwell was able to get this image on the cover, considering there's a Black man there. She even brought it up with the Norman Rockwell Museum, and the president of the museum essentially said, yeah, he shouldn't be there. I can't believe he sort of slid this one by. And once the curators at the Oval Office at the White House figured out that Norman Rockwell was really making a statement about social justice, about equality, they reinstalled the work above a sculptural bust of Martin Luther King Jr., because this isn't just a picture about liberty or about American leadership. This is a picture about equality. And so there's this kind of new understanding and appreciation for the work that way. But for Norman Rockwell, as for many people who are kind of struggling or trying their best to be their best selves, to be their least prejudiced selves, his trajectory is not always a straight line. This next image, I think, is a really complicated image, and I don't think it necessarily speaks to perspective that is very clearly very clearly expresses kind of this anti-racist sentiment. This is a complicated image, and it's called Boy in a Dining Car from 1946. So it's painted the same year that he paints the Statue of Liberty. In this case, the boy is one of Norman Rockwell's sons, and he's looking very carefully at the menu here, and he's got his change purse, and he's ready to just about order his food. And so we have a Black porter on the train who's looking down at the boy, waiting to take the order. Now, I think any one of us here knows that there's sort of an interesting dynamic when it comes to adults waiting on children, particularly waiting on children that are not their own. And so I always wonder, what exactly is that man thinking and feeling as he looks down at that boy? Perhaps this is kind of an expression of affection, of patience, or it could be the exact opposite. I think you can read this face in a number of different ways. But of course, Black porters on trains are kind of a really important component of American history. Black Pullman porters in particular were able to make a great living working on trains, essentially serving white families. They made great tips, really. Black Pullman, Pullman working as a porter on a Pullman coach helped to create a Black middle class in America. But of course, the social dynamic once you were on the train meant that these Black men were kind of at the lowest point in terms of the pecking order. They were serving white people and waiting on white children, and so that dynamic was expressed probably more clearly in other kinds of pictures. Again, by Norman Rockwell's mentor here, J.C. Leyendecker, in an earlier image, where we see just kind of the power dynamic that would have existed between a white child and an adult Black man. So it's not really clear what Norman Rockwell was getting at with this picture, but as time goes on, we see a very clear perspective emerge. So his new stance, we'll be looking at this image in a little bit more depth momentarily. But just a brief note about what's happening in Norman Rockwell's life as we move along through time, and his views about race get, I think, more sort of cemented. Here we're looking at the artist in his studio painting his iconic scene of downtown Stockbridge, Massachusetts, which is, quaint small town American life. Now, he and his wife very suddenly up and move from Vermont to Stockbridge because his wife was getting psychiatric care nearby, and this just made her care, getting her care much easier. Now, during this time, Norman Rockwell was also struggling with depression, and he began to receive counseling. And one of the things that he was really struggling with and depressed about was this idea that he wanted to create a picture that had real significance and really dealt with an important issue. He wanted to create something meaningful. And so this was something that he was going to kind of struggle with for the next decade of his life. But it's in 1953, he's already at this point. So we'll sort of move quickly through through the 1950s. And we'll see that Norman Rockwell continues on to create these absolutely charming pictures of American life. In this case, this is a picture called Roadblock, and this dates to the late 1940s, I believe. And so here again, we've got about a dozen white figures who are all pointing and kind of laughing at this bulldog that has blocked the passage of the truck. You'll notice that Norman Rockwell has included two Black children right at the bottom of the image here, because again, they would have been in this neighborhood. It was important for him to include them. Now, as we move through the 50s and into the 1960s, Norman Rockwell's relationship with the Saturday Evening Post begins to change as well. And so February 1960, he's the cover story, and he's called America's Best Loved Artist. The Saturday Evening Post realizes they have essentially a cash cow in Norman Rockwell. And so we see him here in his iconic triple self-portrait where he looks at himself in the mirror, and he looks a little bit like a goofball, but he's able to paint himself looking ever so dashing. But at this point, Norman Rockwell is just really chafing at this rule about paint the depiction of race on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. One of the last images that features the subject of race is this one here, and this dates to 1961, and it is the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And it's, you know, it's a stunning image, particularly knowing how difficult it might have been for him to find all of these different models of color while he's living in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. But he creates a really powerful image connected with the most important powerful message that's really at the heart of all of these different religions as well. Now, you'd think that there's nothing controversial about this, but even in 1961, for many Americans, the notion here was really do unto others that look like you. So this was still kind of a revolutionary image for Norman Rockwell to create at the time. So he does decide to leave the Saturday Evening Post, and that's in 1963. And he wrote, "For 47 years, I portrayed the best of all possible worlds, grandfathers, puppy dogs, things like that. That kind of stuff is dead now, and I think it's about time." Norman Rockwell was getting a little bit radical. Right after he quits the Saturday Evening Post, he sends $500 to the NAACP for a lifetime membership. He has race on his mind, and he wants to convey it on his canvas. So as he was seeing his counselor and thinking about what's an important picture I could make, apparently his counselor's friend was working down in Louisiana with little Ruby Bridges. And so supposedly it was his counselor who suggested, perhaps you want to look at this story. So that brings us to one of Norman Rockwell's most incredible, most celebrated images, which is called The Problem We All Live With, which dates to 1964. And this is, of course, the depiction of Ruby Bridges, who was integrating an all-white school in Louisiana. Now, if you're familiar with Ruby Bridges' story, you know that she was escorted in and out of school every day because there was literally a mob threatening her life outside of the school. So I just wanted to share with you a couple images of the actual Ruby Bridges and those U.S. Marshals and the mob that she was met with every single day. People who were fighting for segregation, who were threatening her life and the lives of her family. Her grandparents were sharecroppers who were forced off of their land. Her father lost her job. The grocery store stopped selling to her mother. For this little girl to receive an education, an equal education, essentially meant that her family lost everything. And then in addition to that, you have this notion of just her safety being threatened every single day. So I should mention Norman Rockwell creates this image of Ruby Bridges, not for the Saturday Evening Post, but for Look magazine. And this wasn't on the cover of Look magazine, it was inside. We'll look at how he navigates that in just a moment. But this is, of course, the kind of image that he could have never created for the Saturday Evening Post because of their editorial rule that they had. So we'll look at this a little bit more closely in just a moment, but I wanted to share with you briefly a letter that went to Look magazine in response to this picture. And they got fan mail and hate mail because of it, but I've always loved this one. Dear Mr. Rockwell, I've never written to a national figure before, nor do I intend to make a habit of it now. Allow me to say that I've never been so deeply moved by any picture as by your painting in the current issue of Look magazine. Thank you for showing this white Southerner how ridiculous he looks. The truth is pretty hard to take until we get it from a Norman Rockwell. So this picture, I think, still has it has incredible power today, but it's interesting to note how powerful it was back then as well. So let's consider how he created it. We know he worked from models and from photographs. In this case, he had 3 models and he sort of compiled them into one figure. I love the photographs here because you can see he put these boards underneath the girls' feet so that it would look like they were walking and in motion. And then we know that he was contending with the fact that this picture would be on the inside of the magazine and that there would be a gutter down the center of the image. In an early sketch, we see he was sort of playing with which side of the gutter would Ruby Bridges be on. Over here, she's sort of hanging back and the tomato has already hit the wall in front of her. And so we know that she's kind of walking into danger. Ultimately, he puts her towards the front, I think, which sort of speaks to her bravery and her eagerness to receive an education. And then that tomato has hit the wall, and we don't know, as viewers, we don't know how closely it came to hitting her. And of course, the red on the wall in our minds is coded blood, it's coded danger. And it really stands out because it's such a monochromatic image. And then it draws your attention to the wall and the fact that there's racial epithet back there and KKK on the wall. And it just very faintly suggests the horror of that mob that she had to contend with every single day. So we see her confidence, her bravery as she's striding forward, protected by these U.S. Marshals. Norman Rockwell cuts them off at the head to emphasize her and her bravery. I mean, she's a child. She's innocent, and that really comes across loud and clear in this picture. This is just an incredible moment that where this picture toured to the White House on the 50th anniversary of the integration of Southern schools. And it was displayed just outside of the Oval Office. So in this remarkable image, we have America's first Black president looking at this iconic image of the integration of schools from 50 years earlier. And standing next to him is Ruby Bridges. And you can go online, there's on YouTube, there's a conversation that they have, and he turns and looks at her and says, I wouldn't be here today if you weren't there then. So a remarkable moment in history captured there. And I would say Norman Rockwell is putting into service with this incredible picture that same skill that he had of showing those poignant moments of isolation, the same feeling that you have when you look at the picture of the little girl looking down at the Christmas party, that sense of isolation here. He does it with Ruby Bridges as well. We can all immediately identify what it would be like to be this little girl being marched into school, surrounded by these men for her own protection. And of course, Norman Rockwell is again kind of using color to separate her, to offset her from everything else in the picture, which is, you know, these gray tones. And then you have her very dark skin and then this kind of pure white dress here. So again, he's finally putting into service those skills that he had, that we've seen all along. He continues to portray images of race in throughout his career in the 1960s. This is a picture of an actual event that he read about, was really fascinated by. 3 civil rights workers who were murdered in Mississippi by an angry mob, a racist mob that was led by the local sheriff. And he was so fascinated by this particular story, he tore it out of a newspaper clipping, and then he kind of worked over the scene again and again. An earlier draft shows the mob facing the civil rights workers. A later draft, which his editors decided would suffice in terms of the final image for publication, just shows the mob's shadows. It shows one civil rights worker that has already fallen, another one that has already been shot, and then the final one who's sort of staring down his inevitable fate in this case. Norman Rockwell, again, working with photographs in order to sort of create exactly the scene he wants to portray in paint. Here we see he got even special dispensation to get human blood to wipe it on that shirt sleeve so that he could paint it accurately in his picture. And the picture, of course, went to Look magazine. Another painting that he did for Look magazine was to illustrate a very influential article by Sargent Shriver in 1965 called How Goes the War on Poverty? And once again, Norman Rockwell gives us this kind of stacked picture, sort of like the golden rule of people of different skin types, different ages, all kind of looking out at us and as though forcing us to confront the issue of poverty in the United States and the fact that it affects everybody across any sort of socioeconomic or racial divide imaginable. But I would say the last real sort of masterwork from this period of Norman Rockwell's life is The New Kids on the Block from 1967, and this is really a masterwork in so many ways. He's telling us so much about American culture with this picture. So this is, of course, a picture about a Black family integrating into a white neighborhood. We've got the moving van here. We've got their possessions coming out of the moving van, their living room essentially on the front lawn. And here they are confronting a group of white children who live in the neighborhood. And Norman Rockwell is giving us all these reasons to be nervous about this interaction. He's literally giving us dogs and cats and a white cat and a black dog. So we imagine that these kids are going to fight, that they're not going to get along, that, you know, they're set up to kind of fail in terms of in terms of their relationships here. But he then also includes a clue that tells us that everything's actually going to be just fine and that they probably have more in common than we would even think. This boy is holding a baseball glove behind his back, and this boy is holding one. And look, this boy's even in his baseball uniform. So you can imagine that, you know, they'll be playing catch on the front lawn in just a moment's time. But this is that sort of pregnant moment where everybody is kind of sizing each other up. And I think the subtleties of, you know, who's kind of leaning back on their heels and who's kind of leaning forward, and this moment in terms of all that uncertainty is really conveyed in such a masterful way. If you have really good eyes, you'll notice that there's even a nosy neighbor out up here who's watching all of it unfold. Here are a few photographs of Norman Rockwell working with his models, even his dog model in this case. And then here is a mural down in New Orleans that shows just the opposite. It's the white family integrating into a Black neighborhood. And in this case, it's going to be soccer that brings everybody together. And I will just say that I think Norman Rockwell is using this other skill that he has, the skill of making us all feel like we're a part of the American dream. And he does that here with the New Kids on the Block. Because what he's really showing us is this moment of confronting something that's new and something that's uncertain. And essentially, don't we do this in every new relationship? Isn't this a really universal experience? And then with almost every new relationship, we have the experience of realizing that we have more in common with someone than we have that separates us from them. So in the same way that he created something that was very relatable with an image like Going and Coming, um, he gives us that same relatable moment with the New Kids on the Block. And I think it's important to note, he didn't show us the moment where they're playing ball. He's showing us the moment where they're trying to sort of essentially size up what this relationship will be. And that is essentially where so much of America was at the same time, at this time when this was painted. Here is the artist with this work of art. He was 70 years old when he painted it. And I just love that look of defiance on his face. Just one last picture to round out this series that he does for Look magazine. This was a picture that he created called The Right to Know from 1968. So this is people confronting their government, and it's a real cross section of American society here: the young, the old, the black, the white. Norman Rockwell even includes himself over here on the right, alongside some hippies even. And I think, you know, this is very far from the way people think of Norman Rockwell in general. They think of him as like incredibly patriotic images, you know, puppy dogs and grandpas, and they don't think of, they don't extend that line of patriotism to this this kind of image where I think you could still look at an image like this and think that this is a patriotic image. So to wrap up Norman Rockwell and his life, the final word here, one of his last cover images was painted in 1976 for American Artist magazine. It was their 4th of July cover. And here he is in the final years of his life. His ability to paint detail has certainly waned, but he shows himself putting a happy birthday banner on an American icon, the Liberty Bell. And I think the Liberty Bell is a great icon to represent America for Norman Rockwell, because it is flawed, but it is still encapsulates sort of the best of what we think of America. And I think that's how Norman Rockwell thought of this country. He saw the flaws, but he loved it, and he advocated for it along the way. So just a year later, he receives the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Gerald Ford. This is him sitting in his studio after the fact, examining the award. He dies in 1978, and by February 1979, the Saturday Evening Post says, "Oh, it's our boy again," and he's celebrated on the cover, despite, you know, that break that they had in the early 1960s. So so to wrap up for this evening, I just like to visit the fact that there are so many artists alive and working today who are using Norman Rockwell's work as inspiration for work that speaks to the diversity that exists in America and always has. So they go back to these iconic works like The Four Freedoms, and they recreate them with a more diverse cast of characters. They create images that more accurately reflect America. Here's just, this is Maggie Miners. This is another artist that's looking at Norman Rockwell's work and re-examining Norman Rockwell's work today. This is Eric Gottesman. And you have to believe, based on everything you've heard tonight, that if Norman Rockwell had the freedom to paint the way he wanted to paint, that his images probably would have been much more diverse images that really reflected all of American culture in his work. So, so I'll end on that, you know, nice kind of hopeful note, and I welcome any questions or comments anybody might have about Norman Rockwell and his evolving views on race. So please feel free to type them in the chat.
Jane, thank you so much. This was such an incredible presentation. And yeah, I invite people too, if you do want to, you know, speak up. Sometimes it's nicer to ask a question right over the microphone.
Yeah, we're an intimate group, so if
we are, yeah.
So if you'd rather talk, that's fine too. I know there's a lot to process there, and I gave a lot of information. But I think it's, I always love this program because it's, I think everybody is, has had a new education on race since George Floyd's death last year. And occasionally it's nice to hear an uplifting story from the 20th century about race. And I think it helps us to kind of better understand how imagery and how even mass media functions in terms of reinforcing stereotypes, and how courageous one has to be in order to go against the grain there. So thank you for the kind words in the chat. I appreciate that.
Jean, I guess I had I kind of pulled a quote from you earlier where you said, the work he was doing in the later parts of his career was far from the way people think of Norman Rockwell, especially that really kind of devastating painting of Ruby Bridges. So do you have, I don't know if you know of any researchers or art historians who've kind of looked at, why do you think Norman Rockwell was sort of selectively remembered in the way that he was? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question, Eric. And I think off the top of my head, I think it's because he had such a long career with the Saturday Evening Post. That was 47 years. And that was reaching, they had such a huge circulation, and particularly those images after World War II. They were powerful images. They really resonated, and they were, widely reproduced. Look magazine, I don't think, had the same reach. And of course, there weren't as many people interested in those kinds of images at the time. As he's painting for Look magazine, all these national publications were generally using photographs for their covers and for their stories. So what he was doing sort of had, believe it or not, sort of less importance, less cultural resonance than photography at the time. So I think it was, it was like sheer numbers. There were so many paintings for the Saturday Evening Post, and they had such a strong perspective in terms of the almost saccharine image of white American middle class life, that that these few paintings later on sort of get lost in the shuffle. Teresa, I'm seeing your question about the studios. Oh, thank you so much. I've been meaning to get out to the museum. I haven't been out for years. And I think, now that I have this better understanding of Rockwell, I think I would appreciate it so much more too. Thank you for the kind words. I really appreciate it, everybody. I'm gonna spend the rest of the night trying to fit through my doors with a giant head. Thank you. I know it, and I think it's just really nice to learn about somebody who is trying to do the right thing, throughout their career, and then ends up making these images that still have such a tremendous impact to look at them, and have like a whole new cultural relevance too. I think a lot of people have seen the kind of viral meme of Ruby Bridges walking, and then Kamala Harris running, or something, or some variation on that. There's a new appreciation for these images, and these images are used to tell this, how important it is that we have a Black female vice president. And it's extraordinary that it was just such a short time ago that it was that a Black girl getting an education at an all-white school was cause for such vitriol and such violence.
Yeah. Does anybody else have other questions or maybe comments that you wanted to ask before we depart?
Well, I do have my website there, so if anything comes up later on, please feel free to get in touch. And I also have a schedule on my website of other public programs that I do with other organizations, and those are all free as well. So you can link to those and see what else I'm doing too.
Yeah, and I'll send out a follow-up email to everyone tomorrow, or actually it may take me a little bit of time to process the video, but once the video is processed, I'll send you, the recording, and also link to the website and Jane's schedule for other talks. And hopefully we'll be able to work together again soon to offer another one.
Love that. I would love that. Well, thank you again, everybody, for sharing your evening with us. I appreciate it.
It was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Jane, for sharing it. This was really incredible. You packed a lot of info in there.
I know there's a lot. It's dense.
No, but that's great. Okay.
All right. Well, good night, everybody. Take care.
Good night, all.
You
Thanks for
too.
making it.